It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon at Rosie's Diner, the kind of place where the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee welcomed locals and travelers alike. The helm of conversation, clinking cutlery, and the occasional laughter created a comforting backdrop, making it the perfect spot for a quick meal or a quiet escape. Seated in the far-right corner booth, Officer Mark Daniels sipped his coffee, scanning the room out of habit more than necessity. After years on the force, his instincts never took a day off. That's when he noticed her, a girl, no older than 9 or 10, sitting across from a man who appeared to be her father. She had long brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her small hands fidgeting with a paper napkin on the table. The man across from her, middle-aged, wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans, seemed outwardly unremarkable. Yet something about the way he leaned forward, speaking in low, clipped tones, set off quiet alarms in Mark's mind. The girl, eyes downcast, nodded occasionally but barely touched her plate. She looked uneasy. Mark shook his head, telling himself he was probably reading too much into it. Not every awkward family dynamic was a cause for concern. Still, he couldn't ignore the way her shoulders hunched as if she wanted to make herself invisible. He decided to keep an eye on them while finishing his meal. Moments later, the man stood abruptly, tossing a few bills on the table and mumbling something to the girl. She hesitated before sliding out of the booth, her small frame dwarfed by his looming presence as they walked toward the door. Just as they reached the exit, she suddenly broke away and turned, heading straight toward Mark. "Officer?" Her voice was barely audible, a whisper drowned out by the diner's bustle, but Mark heard it. He leaned down, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, lowering his coffee cup. She glanced back at the man who had stopped at the door, his expression darkening as he realized she was talking to someone. The girl leaned in closer, her lips trembling as she whispered something into Mark's ear. Whatever she said stopped him cold. The air around them seemed to freeze, every sound in the diner fading into the background. Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he straightened up, scanning the room. Without a moment's hesitation, he stood and signaled to his partner, who had just entered to join him for lunch. "Stay here," Mark said firmly to the girl, his voice calm but commanding. He motioned for another patient, a woman seated nearby, to keep an eye on her. Then he turned his full attention to the man at the door, who was now trying to slip out unnoticed. "Excuse me, sir," Mark called, his tone sharp and authoritative. The man froze, his hand on the door handle. Slowly he turned, a strained smile on his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice tinged with an unsettling mix of annoyance and forced politeness. Mark's hand hovered near his holster, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary encounter. "Mind answering a few questions?" he asked, keeping his voice steady but firm. The diner seemed to hold its breath as the tension thickened, all eyes now on the unfolding scene. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm Mark's suspicions. In the next heartbeat, the officer's partner flanked the man, and everything spiraled into motion. 15 seconds later, the man was in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the murmurs of the stunned diner patrons. Mark glanced back at the girl, who was now being comforted by the kind stranger he'd enlisted to watch over her. She looked up at him with wide, teary eyes, as if unsure whether to feel relief or fear. "Don't worry," Mark said softly. "You're safe now." But as he walked back toward her, his mind raced with questions. What had this man done? And how had this brave little girl found the courage to whisper the truth in a moment that changed everything? The answers were only beginning to unravel, and what they would reveal would shock everyone to their core. The diner buzzed with murmurs as Mark led the man out the front door, his partner steady at his side. The suspect kept glancing over his shoulder at the little girl, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made Mark's gut twist. He'd seen that look before. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was the look of someone calculating their next move. Inside, the girl sat stiffly on the vinyl bench where Mark had left her, their small hands gripping the edge of the seat as if holding on to keep from crumbling. The woman sitting beside her offered soft reassurances, though the girl barely seemed to hear her. Mark's partner, Officer Jenna Holt, re-entered the diner and crouched down to the girl's level. "Hey there," Jenna said gently, her tone warmer than Mark's more direct approach. "My name's Jenna. Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated, her lips parting but no sound coming out. Her eyes darted toward the door, where Mark was securing the man in their patrol car. Finally, in a barely audible voice, she whispered, "Maddie." "That's a pretty name, Maddie," Jenna said with a small smile. You did something really brave just now. Can you tell me what's going on? Are you hurt? Her eyes scanned Maddie's face and arms for any visible signs of injury. Maddie shook her head but kept her eyes down, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized hoodie. He's not my dad, she said suddenly, her voice cracking. He told me to say he was, but he's not. Jenna's breath caught, her instincts kicking into overdrive. Okay, she said carefully. That's okay, we're going to figure this out. Can you tell me how you know him? Maddie hesitated again, her small frame trembling. She looked at Jenna, then over to Mark, who had just walked back in. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He took me. Mark and Jenna exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. This was no ordinary case of family drama. Whatever they'd stumbled into was far darker than either of them had anticipated. Mark crouched down beside Jenna, his voice calm but firm. Maddie, do you know where your real parents are, or anyone we can call to help? She shook her head again, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't have parents. I was at the shelter. He said he was taking me somewhere safe. Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, trying to stifle a sob. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew the system all too well. How kids like Maddie, without stable homes or guardians, could easily slip through the cracks. But the fact that this man had posed as her guardian, convincing her to leave with him, was chilling. There was a method to this, a plan, and Mark's instincts told him this wasn't the man's first time pulling something like this. Jenna put a comforting hand on Maddie's shoulder. You're safe now, Maddie, she said softly. I promise. We're going to make sure nothing bad happens to you. Outside, a small crowd had gathered near the patrol car, curious diners craning their necks to see what the commotion was about. Mark motioned for them to disperse, his no-nonsense expression making it clear he wasn't in the mood for onlookers. As he stepped back inside, his mind raced with possibilities. Who was this man? What had he planned to do with Maddie? And how had she found the courage to reach out for help? For every question answered, a dozen more loomed in its place. Jenna pulled Mark aside, her voice low. We need to run his ID ASAP. Something's not adding up here. He wasn't expecting her to say anything, that's for sure. And did you notice how calm he was when we cuffed him? Like he's done this before. Mark nodded, his gaze shifting back to Maddie, who was now sipping a glass of water brought over by one of the diner staff. We'll get his name and run it through the system. In the meantime, we need to figure out where Maddie's been and how long she's been with him. If he's part of something bigger. Jenna didn't need him to finish the thought. They both knew how cases like this could spiral into something far worse than either of them wanted to imagine. Hey, Maddie, Jenna said as she returned to the booth, her tone light but steady. We're going to take you somewhere safe, okay? But first, can you tell me how long you've been with that man? Maddie hesitated, her small fingers tracing the edge of her water glass. A week, I think. Maybe more. It's hard to tell. She looked up at Jenna, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. He said I couldn't tell anyone, that no one would believe me. Jenna's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in Maddie's voice. You don't have to worry about that anymore, she said firmly. We believe you, and we're going to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. Mark rejoined them, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. Jenna, can I talk to you for a second? They stepped aside, their voices low. His ID came back, Mark said. Name's Alan Brewer. No priors, no outstanding warrants. But get this, his address is flagged. Neighbors reported unusual activity a few weeks back. Sounds like he might have been holding someone there. Jenna's stomach turned. Could Maddie be only one? Or is there a chance he's taken others? Mark glanced toward Maddie, his eyes heavy with the weight of what they might uncover. That's what I'm afraid of. We need to check out his place. If there's anyone else, we don't have time to waste. Back at the booth, Maddie watched them with quiet suspicion, her instincts sharper than most kids her age. She wasn't sure if she could fully trust them yet, but something about the way Jenna spoke to her, gentle but strong, made her feel like maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. As Mark and Jenna made arrangements to take Maddie to a safe location, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, though the picture they revealed was far from clear. Alan Brewer wasn't just a man who'd made a bad decision. He was something far worse, and Maddie's bravery had not only saved her life but potentially many others. But what they didn't know yet was how deep this would go, or how far Alan was willing to go to keep his secrets hidden. The drive to the station was quiet, except for the faint hum of the cruiser's engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Maddie sat in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket Officer Jenna had given her, her knees pulled to her chest. Mark glanced at her in the rearview mirror every so often, trying to gauge her state of mind. She looked tired, but there was something else in her expression, a wariness that seemed too heavy for someone her age. Jenna, seated in the passenger seat, scrolled through reports on her tablet, her brow furrowed. The shelter she mentioned, she said quietly to Mark, "It checks out. Lost Pines Youth Center." They confirmed Maddie had been there for about 2 months. She was brought in after her previous foster home fell apart. Mark gripped the wheel a little tighter, and no one noticed she was gone. "They noticed," Jenna said grimly. "She was reported missing 5 days ago. The staff said they were working with local police, but they didn't have much to go on. No leads, no witnesses." Mark exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. 5 days, and she's been with him longer than that. Jenna nodded, her voice dropping further, which means he either had her stashed somewhere before moving her, or there's more to his operation than we realize. Maddie shifted in the backseat, her small voice breaking the silence. "Are you going to take me back there, to the shelter?" Jenna turned to face her, her tone softening. "Not right now, Maddie. First, we need to make sure you're safe. There's a place we can take you, where no one can find you unless we say so. You'll have people looking out for you. Does that sound okay?" Maddie hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Will he come after me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Not if we have anything to say about it," he said firmly. "He's not getting anywhere near you again." The words seemed to provide some comfort, but the shadow of fear lingered in Maddie's eyes. Jenna turned back around, her jaw set. Mark could see the same determination in her that he felt, an unspoken vow to get to the bottom of this. When they arrived at the station, Maddie was quietly led to a private room where a social worker was waiting. The woman, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, introduced herself as Lisa and assured Maddie she was there to help. Maddie didn't say much, but she seemed to relax slightly in Lisa's presence. Meanwhile, Mark and Jenna got to work. Anne Brewer's file was thin, but the flagged address and neighbor complaints painted a picture of a man who'd managed to fly under the radar while engaging in suspicious activities. The neighbors' reports mentioned late-night visitors, blacked-out windows, and odd noises, enough to raise eyebrows but not enough to warrant immediate action. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "We need to get a warrant to search his place," he said. "If there's anything there, anything that ties him to other kids, we have to find it." Jenna nodded, already drafting the request. "And we need to dig deeper into his background. No priors doesn't mean he's clean. He could have been careful, or he's part of something bigger." Mark's phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He glanced at the screen. A text from his contact at the precinct where Alan Brewer had been taken for processing. "Brewer isn't talking. Keeps asking for a lawyer, but there's something off about him. He doesn't seem rattled, almost like he expected this." Mark frowned. He'd seen it before, suspects who seemed too calm, too collected, as if they knew something the authorities didn't. It wasn't confidence. It was control. "We need to move fast," Mark said, standing abruptly. If he's got people on the outside, they could already be cleaning up whatever trail he left behind. As Jenna continued her work, Mark decided to check in on Maddie. He found her sitting with Lisa, who was softly asking questions about her time with Alan. Maddie answered in short, hesitant sentences, her voice shaky but clear. "He said I had to be good," Maddie was saying as Mark stepped into the room. "He said if I wasn't, I'd go somewhere worse." Lisa's expression remained calm, but her eyes flicked to Mark, a silent exchange passing between them. "Somewhere worse?" Lisa asked gently. "Did he say what that meant?" Maddie shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "No, but he was on the phone a lot. He talked to people about moving things. I think he meant kids. Like me." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Maddie, do you remember anything he said on those calls? Anything that might help us figure out who he was talking to?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing as she thought. "He called one of them Mr. Dean," she said finally, "and he said something about a pickup, but I don't know what that means." Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa. "That's more than enough, Maddie," he said gently. "You've done a great job helping us." As Maddie's words sank in, Mark felt the weight of the situation grow heavier. If Alan Brewer was part of a network, a system designed to exploit kids like Maddie, then they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a lone predator. Back at his desk, Jenna was already making headway. "I ran the name Maddie mentioned. Mr. Dean," she said as Mark approached. "It's a long shot, but I found a Dean Wexler with ties to known trafficking rings. He operates under the radar, using middlemen to handle the dirty work. Brewer could be one of them. Mark felt a surge of anger. If Wexler's involved, we need to act fast. Brewer might be small time, but if we squeeze him hard enough, he could lead us straight to Wexler. Jenna nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I'm already pulling everything we have on Wexler, but we need Brewer to talk. If he's loyal, he won't crack easily. Mark stared at the screen, the images and reports blurring together as his mind raced. They had a name, a lead, and a little girl who'd been through more than anyone her age should ever have to endure. But they still didn't have the full picture, and the clock was ticking. Somewhere out there, others like Maddie might still be in danger. And Mark knew that every second they wasted was a second too long. Mark paced the length of the station's briefing room, the tension in the air palpable as officers gathered around the table. Jenna stood near the whiteboard, pinning up a map of Alan Brewer's neighborhood. She'd circled his house in red, lines drawn to nearby properties where neighbors had reported suspicious activity. The team was assembling the pieces of a puzzle that felt more intricate and more sinister by the second. Here's what we know so far, Jenna began, her tone clipped and focused. Brewer was using his house as a base, but he wasn't acting alone. Based on Maddie's testimony and the flagged calls on his phone, we believe he's connected to Dean Wexler, a known player in trafficking operations. Wexler's MO involves middlemen who transport and conceal victims before moving them to his larger network. Mark stopped pacing, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Brewer might be one of the small fish, but we're not underestimating him. He's been careful, no priors, no immediate red flags, but the fact that he's staying silent tells us he's protecting someone bigger. Wexler, or someone close to him, is likely calling the shots. Jenna nodded. We've secured a warrant for Brewer's property. If there's any evidence there, documents, photos, anything, we'll find it. But we have to assume that if Brewer isn't panicking, Wexler might already be cleaning house. The room was silent for a moment as the weight of her words sunk in. Finally, one of the younger officers asked, "What about Maddie? Does she know anything else?" Mark exchanged a glance with Jenna. She's already told us more than most kids in her situation ever could. But no, she doesn't have any names or locations beyond what we've already uncovered. She's done her part. Now it's on us. The team dispersed, preparing for the search while Mark and Jenna stay behind to finalize the plan. Mark leaned against the table, his jaw tight. If Wexler's tied to this, we can't afford to miss anything. Maddie's not the only one. There's more out there. You feel it too, don't you? Jenna met his gaze, her expression grim. Yeah, I do. Every second we waste is another kid we might lose. An hour later, Mark and Jenna, along with a tactical team, arrived at Brewer's property. The house sat on the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, its windows dark, the yard overgrown with weeds. From the outside, it looked like any other rundown house in the neighborhood, but Mark's gut told him it was hiding something far worse. The team moved quickly, reaching the door with precision. Inside, the house was eerily silent, the air thick with the stench of mildew and stale air. Mark's flashlight swept across the living room, revealing scattered furniture and piles of unopened mail. Brewer had clearly been living a double life, outwardly unremarkable, but secretly steeped in something far darker. "Clear," one officer called from the kitchen. "Clear," echoed another from the hallway. Mark and Jenna moved deeper into the house, their senses on high alert. In the bedroom, Jenna's flashlight landed on a small desk cluttered with papers and an old laptop. She motioned for a tech officer to start collecting evidence. Mark's attention, however, was drawn to a locked door at the end of the hallway. Something about it felt off. The lock was newer than the rest of the house, and faint scratches around the frame suggested it had been opened and closed frequently. He gestured for backup, his voice low. "Over here." The team gathered as Mark forced the door open, the lock giving way with a sharp crack. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into a basement. The air grew colder as they descended, the faint hum of machinery growing louder. At the bottom, they found a space that was both chilling and surreal. The walls were lined with metal shelves filled with crates and files. A row of monitors flickered on a makeshift desk, displaying grainy security footage from different angles around the house and beyond. "What the hell is this?" Jenna murmured, her flashlight sweeping across the room. Mark didn't answer, his focus on a bulletin board covered with photos, dozens of them. Kids of all ages, their faces staring back like silent accusations. Some were smiling, clearly taken from happier times. Others were blurred, as if hastily captured from a distance. In the corner of the board, Maddie's photo was pinned with a note scrawled beneath it, "Delivered." Jenna's breath hitched. This isn't just a middleman operation. He's documenting them, cataloging them. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. Get this all bagged and tag it, he ordered the team. Every photo, every file. We're not leaving anything behind. As the team worked, Jenna called out from the desk. Mark, you need to see this. He crossed the room to where she was staring at the computer screen. The laptop had been unlocked, revealing a series of emails between Brewer and someone identified only as D. The messages were short, coded, but the intent was clear. Brewer was coordinating pickups and drop-offs, reporting back to someone higher up. This is it, Jenna said, her voice low. Proof of the network. Before Mark could respond, the radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Officer Daniels. Urgent update. Mark grabbed his radio. Go ahead. Brewer's transport has been intercepted en route to the courthouse. Armed individuals attempted to break him out. Mark's heart sank. Status. Backup is on scene. Brewer secure, but the suspects fled. No IDs yet, but they were heavily armed. This wasn't random. Jenna swore under her breath. Wexler, he's tying up loose ends. Mark's mind raced. If Wexler was willing to go this far to silence Brewer, then they were running out of time. The evidence they'd found was enough to connect Brewer to the operation, but they needed more to bring down the entire network, and they needed it now. As they prepared to leave the house, a faint noise caught Mark's attention. It was coming from behind a false wall in the corner of the basement. He motioned for the team to stop, his flashlight fixed on the seam in the wall. Someone's there, he said quietly. The tension in the room was electric as the team moved into position. Mark reached for the panel, pulling it aside to reveal a small, hidden space. Inside, huddled in the shadows, were two children, a boy and a girl, no older than Maddie. Their eyes were wide with fear, but as Mark crouched down and extended a hand, his voice softened. It's okay, he said. You're safe now. The boy hesitated, then took Mark's hand, his grip trembling. The girl followed, clutching a warm, stuffed animal to her chest. Jenna stepped forward, her voice gentle. We're going to take care of you. I promise. As the children were escorted out, Mark stood, his jaw tight. The stakes had just been raised. Brewer's capture was only the beginning. Wexler's network was larger and more dangerous than they'd imagined, and if they didn't act fast, more lives would be at risk. The clock was ticking, and the fight was far from over. The ride back to the station was anything but quiet. Mark's thoughts churned, his grip tight on the steering wheel as the weight of the case bore down on him. Jenna, seated beside him, was scrolling through the emails recovered from Brewer's laptop, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. In the backseat, the two children they'd rescued sat huddled together, wrapped in blankets provided by the EMTs. Their silence was deafening, their wide eyes darting between the flashing lights of the cruiser and each other. They're not talking, Jenna muttered, breaking the tension. The kids, they haven't said a word since we pulled them out. They've been through hell, Mark replied, his voice low. It might take time. Or they might not feel safe yet. Jenna nodded, her focus shifting back to the emails. There's something odd about this communication chain. Brewer wasn't just taking orders. He was reporting back, sure, but there are gaps. Big ones, like pieces are missing. Mark frowned. Deleted. Possibly, Jenna said. But if he deleted them, he wasn't careful about it. There's a chance we can recover the files. Something about this setup feels too polished for a guy like Brewer. Mark's gut twisted. Brewer hadn't struck him as the mastermind type. He was too sloppy, too obvious. But if someone else was pulling the strings, they might have underestimated how far Brewer would go to protect himself or their operation. The attempted breakout earlier had proven one thing. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until their secrets were buried. When they arrived back at the station, Maddie was waiting in a secure room with Lisa, the social worker. Her eyes lit up when she saw the two officers, but her expression quickly shifted to one of cautious hope when she noticed the two other children following close behind. Mark knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. Maddie, these are Jenna and Owen, he said, gesturing to the children. We found them at the house. I think they could use a friend right now. Think you can help with that? Maddie hesitated, then nodded, her small hand reaching out to take Jenna's. The two children exchanged wary glances but allowed Maddie to lead them to the couch. Lisa gave Mark a knowing look, her expression equal parts relief and concern. We need to talk, Lisa said softly as Jenna approached with her tablet. Maddie opened up a little more while you were gone. Mark's pulse quickened. What did she say? Lisa hesitated, glancing toward Maddie to ensure she was out of earshot. She remembered something about one of Brewer's calls. She said he used the word shipment. It sounded like, more kids, maybe more than just the two you found. Mark felt his chest tighten. Did she say where? No, Lisa said, shaking her head. But she said she heard him mention a date. It's soon, Mark, really soon. Jenna looked up from her tablet, her face pale. Mark, you need to see this. I ran a deeper search on Wexler. He's not just tied to trafficking networks. He's been linked to offshore operations, ports, shipping containers, the works. If this shipment Maddie heard about is real, it's not going to stay local. Mark's heart sank. The stakes had just skyrocketed. If Wexler was planning to move a group of children out of the country, their window to intervene was shrinking by the second. We need Brewer to talk, Mark said, his voice firm. He's the only one who knows the timeline. If we don't get to Wexler before the shipment leaves, we lose everything. Before Jenna could respond, a commotion erupted near the interrogation rooms. Officers were shouting, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the tile floor. Mark and Jenna exchanged a glance before rushing toward the noise. Brewer was on the floor, clutching his throat, his face turning a sickly shade of blue. The officer stationed outside his room shouted for medical help, his expression panicked. He's choking. Mark dropped to his knees beside Brewer, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. But something wasn't right. Brewer's pupils were dilated, his breaths shallow even as Mark tried to clear his airway. Jenna's eyes widened in realization. Poison, she said, her voice tight. He's been poisoned. How? Mark demanded, his mind racing. Brewer had been under constant supervision since his arrest. No one had been allowed near him. Jenna's gaze darted toward the water bottle on the table. It has to be that. Someone got to him. The paramedics arrived, but Mark already knew it was too late. Brewer's body went limp, his head lolling to the side. Jenna stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened settling over them both. Someone knew we'd try to flip him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They silenced him before he could talk. Mark clenched his fists, a deep anger bubbling just below the surface. Wexler's reach was longer than they'd thought, his network more dangerous. Brewer had been a liability, and now, with him gone, the trail was growing colder by the second. But then Mark remembered the laptop, the gaps Jenna had mentioned. What about the files? He asked, his voice urgent. If Brewer's dead, the only thing we have left is the data. Jenna nodded, already pulling out her phone to call the tech team. If there's anything recoverable, we'll find it. As they returned to the evidence room, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being outmaneuvered. Whoever was behind this wasn't just one step ahead, they were running circles around them. But Mark wasn't about to back down. Lives were at stake, and if Wexler thought he could scare them off, he'd made a grave mistake. Back at her desk, Jenna worked quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed the laptop remotely. The team had already begun extracting the data, piecing together fragments of deleted emails and encrypted files. "I've got something," Jenna said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "A manifest. Names, dates, locations. It's incomplete, but it lists a dock. Pier 17. There's a note. Final transfer. Midnight." Mark checked his watch. They had less than 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and with Brewer gone, this was their only chance to stop Wexler's operation before it disappeared for good. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something bigger than they were prepared for, something dangerous. As he and Jenna began mobilizing the team for what was shaping up to be the most critical operation of their careers, Mark glanced back at the secure room where Maddie and the other children sat. Their bravery had brought them this far. Now it was up to him to finish the fight.